Hello, everyone. So, in this class, we are going to be talking about the impact of the Great Depression upon French politics in particular, and what eventually led to the rise of what's known as the Popular Front, a broad left wing coalition that attempted to govern France in the mid 1930s, albeit somewhat unsuccessfully. Okay, so when we last left France in the 1920s, in the crazy years, things were good. Everyone was dancing. Everyone was happy. We obviously talked about there was a certain amount of uneven prosperity in France during the 1920s, but generally the French economy had done quite well. And France, not unlike most of the other countries in Western Europe, there had been some, or certainly unlike the United States, where there had been a great deal of prosperity in the 1920s. Of course, as you all know, that lasts up until about 1929, and then we get the great crash on Wall Street in October 1929. Obviously, with catastrophic consequences for the world economy, and obviously, right now we're going through something that we'll see in terms of its economic effect, but in terms of the suddenness of the collapse of the market, certainly something akin to it. So, bad times in the global market, certainly. So obviously what we have is kind of chaos, alarm bells going off on Wall Street, the economy crashing, and in some cases leading to very, very negative consequences. You're all probably familiar with the famous stories of stockbrokers jumping out of windows as their fortunes collapsed in the United States. Although actually, for what it's worth, is that these stories are largely believed to be untrue, that as grim as things were in 1929, we didn't have mass suicides of stockbrokers. Interestingly enough, the one country in the world, or at least in the Western world, that initially did quite well in the Depression was France. So we have this picture here of Adrian Gillis, and it would be reflecting the smugness of France. That the Great Depression did not immediately strike France. It was able to survive relatively unscathed for a few months, maybe even into 1931. The comment here in the box is from a French government minister. French methods often middling, but always prudent are best. And so to a lot of French people, the fact that France didn't suffer immediate calamity in 1929 was evidence of French economic soundness, that the French had not allowed themselves to engage in rampant capitalism in the same way that the English-speaking world in particular had, and therefore the French were protected. In reality, what was happening was that the French economy, because they were less competitive on the global export market. French did not, compared to the United States, United Kingdom, the French did not have a large amount of exports. They had a high protective tariff wall, which meant that they weren't directly impacted by falling imports either. That the French economy, at least initially, was not directly harmed by the Great Depression. However, it obviously still was connected to the global economy, and by about 1931, some of the first signs of economic depression, or not signs, but the grip of the Great Depression began to be felt in France as well. And ironically, it was industries that had tried to invest most in modern ways, most efficient methods of production, that suffered the most because they were the ones that tend to be most connected to the global market. So Citroën, the famous French car industry, had to file for bankruptcy in 1934, and so those French industries that had tried to modernize were the ones that kind of suffered the most. Those industries that had been more conservative, that had not invested in large-scale machinery, had not invested in maybe more modern methods of production, essentially weren't hurt by the fact that they hadn't invested all that capital, so they tended to survive a little better. There were some French industries that did suffer. The emerging French air transport industry, most of its private companies were forced to collapse, and in fact they were merged together by the French government and created into a new national air transport company, Air France. During the First World War, the French government had been quite active in becoming involved in the economic sphere and taking charge of various industries in order to streamline production to support the war effort. They very much adopted a laissez-faire attitude in the 1920s, where they're trying to stay hands-off of the French economy and have a clear separation between government and private enterprise. The Great Depression, as I'm showing you here with the example of Air France, forced a rethink in those tactics, but it was more kind of piecemeal. There wasn't any kind of comprehensive plan about how to deal with the economic crisis, and that was actually something we saw throughout the various governments' approach into how to deal with the crisis. If you remembered when we finished in our last lecture, Raymond Poincaré was the Prime Minister of France, leading a relatively conservative ministry. Poincaré himself had actually become quite ill very shortly after his resumption as Prime Minister in 1928, and he resigned, and so was left to his successors to struggle on without him. And they really had a hard time trying to figure out what methods they could implement to try and revive or protect the French economy. Tariffs were one potential example, one possible tactic that certainly other countries in the world use, but the problem was the French tariff walls are already quite high, and by increasing the cost of goods to certain consumers, and what you were actually doing was, of course, reducing the spending power of consumers at the same time. So not a particularly effective solution for France. Another issue they had was trying to protect the value of the French franc. Let me give you a Jeopardy question here. So this valuable benchmark was a unit of account for many national currencies in the 19th and 20th centuries. By unit of account, I mean what gave these currencies their value. And the answer is, what is the gold standard? Gold. So the French franc, we talked about this in an earlier class, had undergone a series of declines in the 1920s, where its value was essentially starting to collapse, and the French government had responded in 1928 under Poincaré by putting the French franc on the gold standard, and the idea was that this would stabilize the value of the French franc. All well and good, but of course, once the depression hits, this then meant that the French government, by keeping the value of the franc artificially high, made it more difficult for French manufacturers to export, which obviously hurt business as well. Another tactic the government tried to adopt, as well as private business, was cutting wages. So the government tried to slash its budget and to reduce wages of government employees. But the problem with that tactic, of course, is that you were taking more money out of circulation. You were depressing people's purchasing power, and you can get the sense that the French government was in something of a vicious cycle in order to try and break its the hold of the depression upon the French economy. When the elections were next held in France in 1932, not surprisingly, there was a shift away from the conservative government that had held power since 1928. That party of the left tended to do better. So we see here the French section of the Workers' International, that is the Socialist Party, won a large number of seats, as did the Radical Republican Party. And between them, they form a new government, and they return this man, Edouard Herriot, as Prime Minister. Of course, we have seen Herriot as Prime Minister before.
I'm back.
Herriot, if you remember, was Prime Minister in the mid 1920s. Largely had an unsuccessful stint as Prime Minister, and the new government under Herriot in 1932, as you can see, doesn't last very long. Herriot was only in power for another 6 months. Part of the issue was the Socialist Party, while officially supporting Herriot's government, would not officially enter into government itself. It wouldn't take any government ministry positions, and therefore was not, I guess, fully committed to the government, and therefore not a reliable partner for the Radical Republicans. And in this political and economic kind of stagnant period, there was lots of new ideas, or lots of thinkers essentially were trying to put forward ideas. How do we improve the French economy? How do we improve the French government? What tactics could we introduce to improve the political situation in France overall? In general, there was a consensus that the problem with the Third Republic was that it lacked, this picture here, I'm not sure if you get what I'm going for, a strong executive. It lacked a strong executive branch. That Parliament was, the Prime Minister of France, who served essentially as the executive branch, was too much held to the whims of the Parliament. I mean, we see that at no stage during the 70 years of the Third Republic did any Prime Minister last 4 years, and this weak executive branch resulted in a lack of clear direction for the French government. And this was particularly evident during the Great Depression, but this had been a criticism of the regime for a long time, even going back to the First World War. And as a result of that, what had emerged was a particularly fragmented French political scene. I'll give you another Jeopardy question. So this word, referring to the disintegration of a former European country, refers to an entity that fractures into pieces. And I hope you guys would know this refers to Balkanization, the Balkan Peninsula, the political fragmentation of the Balkan Peninsula in the 1990s. In some ways, the French political landscape was very, very similar. So that's what the image I'm going for here is meant to represent, that the political scene was too fragmented. And you saw that in the shot I put up a few minutes ago of the number of political parties, that there was kind of a party for every kind of niche taste on the left and the right, but what that resulted in was there was very rarely strong governments, and oftentimes governments emerged that were incapable of introducing significant reform and change. So the Great Depression was also a time of reassessment of French character in terms of its intellectual trends and characteristics. One of the best examples of this was Emmanuel Mounier, who was a French critical thinker. Mounier's ascent in French intellectual circles kind of marked a return in France of Catholicism to the political left, or at least the political centre. Since the Dreyfus affair, Catholicism had been very much strongly linked with the conservative right, and oftentimes on the far right in particular. The older kind of democratic, socialist, Catholic tradition of France had been somewhat lost. But under Mounier, there was a kind of revival of this, and partly it's helped by the fact that in 1926 the Pope condemned Action Française under Charles Maurras, and had essentially opened up a gap in which French Catholics could reconsider more traditional socialist ideas and not see them as anathema to their own religion. Mounier began publishing an important journal, Esprit, began in 1932, and he advocated, him and his followers advocated something that was known as personalism. Personalism essentially was an effort to try and find a moral code that cut a middle path between, on the one hand, the absolute collectivism of socialism and communism, and on the other hand, the kind of hardline individualism of the French right. And so personalism was an effort to reconcile Catholic doctrines on social justice and on good Christian living with a style of politics that was neither too collectivist nor too kind of selfish or individualist in that sense. We also see a reflection of intellectual trends in some of the novels that were published during the Great Depression in France. I want to show you an example of a few of them. One of them was, so in the French title here, the English translation being The Diary of a Country Priest, published by George Bernanos in 1932, where essentially he talked about the book was essentially about a priest who was struggling with his faith in terms of the indifference of French society, and in some ways was a critique of the struggles of French Catholics in particular to kind of maintain their traditional conservative views. Another famous writer was André Malraux, who published a couple of novels. One is Man's Hope, published in 1934, and then followed up by Man's Fate, which was published after, I think it was 1937. Both of these novels kind of glorified the struggle of socialist people of the left. So Man's Hope was set in China, the efforts to establish communism in China. Man's Fate was set during the Spanish Civil War. Both of these novels kind of championed left-leaning activists who were willing to use military force in order to achieve the socialist revolution. It would be a mistake, of course, to assume that all French writers were particularly left-leaning. Perhaps the most brilliant French writer of the period was Louis Ferdinand Céline, who was very much on the opposite. His two novels, Death on the Installment Plan and Journey to the End of the Night, were much more nihilistic. And while they were very notable in terms of the quality of language, Céline's characteristic was also a kind of rampant racism, homophobic tendencies, criticisms of women, of all the forces of what he considered to be progressivism that he felt were corrupting French society and dragging it down, and ultimately were to the detriment of France itself.